Have you ever stopped to think if those famous 30 pieces of silver were truly a fortune, or merely the price of a common betrayal? The story many know hides economic, social, and political details that completely change how we understand the value of money in biblical times. Today, you will discover what was actually bought with ancient coins, who controlled the wealth, and why certain transactions changed the destiny of entire peoples. Prepare to see the Bible under a totally different perspective, based on real historical context and revelations that almost no one explains. Stay until the end, because the final revelation may completely change what you have always believed about the price of betrayal and the true value of these coins. Subscribe to the channel now, leave your like, and share this video with those who love to discover the hidden secrets of biblical history. Money in biblical times. What the 30 pieces of silver really bought Jerusalem, year 33 of the Christian era. Night covers the city like a heavy mantle. A man crosses narrow alleys, avoiding gazes, and enters a room where religious leaders wait in calculated silence. The meeting is brief. Words are exchanged. A deal is closed. When he leaves, he carries a small leather pouch tied to his belt. Inside it, 30 pieces of silver clink with every hurried step. The weight is modest. It fits in the palm of a hand. But that handful of metal will become the most infamous payment in human history, echoing through the centuries as an eternal symbol of betrayal. To understand what those coins were truly worth, you must return to a world where money was not a number on a screen, but sweat transformed into solid metal. Long before there were banks with steel, vaults, cards with chips, or any digital system, money carried literal weight. It was not an abstract concept. It was a physical object that you held, kept, and hid. You could feel your wealth in your hands, calculate your assets by the volume they occupied in a wooden chest, and more importantly, you could lose absolutely everything if someone took that chest during the night. Money in biblical times functioned this way: tangible, vulnerable, dangerously real. In the earliest periods recorded in the scriptures, even before the invention of minted coins, commercial transactions occurred through raw, heavy metals. Silver, primarily, for being abundant enough to circulate, but rare enough to maintain stable value. Gold for the wealthiest and for large-scale negotiations. Bronze for the smaller exchanges of daily life. The value was not printed anywhere. There were no engraved numbers. It lay exclusively in the weight. Professional merchants carried precision scales hanging from their belts, delicate instruments that determined fortunes. Each negotiation required careful weighing before witnesses. No one trusted only the word of another. The scale decided the truth. Imagine the concrete scene. You want to buy a field to plant wheat and feed your family. The seller, after tense negotiations, establishes the final price: 400 shekels of silver. You do not deliver 400 coins counted one by one. That does not exist yet. You bring pieces of raw silver, irregular bars, fragments of melted ancient jewelry, perhaps rings from past generations. You place everything on one plate of the scale, while the seller observes with attentive eyes. On the other plate, he positions stone weights calibrated according to accepted standards. The scale oscillates, stabilizes, indicates. If a single gram is missing, the deal does not close. If there is a surplus, you have lost money that will never be returned. Each transaction was a technical negotiation that required knowledge, patience, and constant vigilance against fraud. It was exactly like this that Abraham bought the field of Machpelah to bury Sarah, his beloved wife. The book of Genesis in chapter 23 records the scene with commercial details surprisingly precise for a sacred text. Ephron the Hittite, owner of the land, establishes the price before all those present: 400 shekels of silver. Abraham does not question, does not bargain in that solemn moment of mourning. He weighs the metal before the witnesses gathered at the city gate, the official location where contracts were closed and disputes resolved. The biblical text makes a point of mentioning that the silver was weighed according to the standard current among the merchants. It was not a symbolic or approximate value. It was a formal transaction, with commercial methodology accepted throughout the market of the time. This weighing system created an absolutely essential profession: the official weighers. men rigorously trained to identify metals adulterated with inferior alloys, calculate purity in different samples, and ensure that no one was deceived in important transactions. In the great cities of the ancient Near East, these professionals held high status, almost priestly in some cultures. Their instruments were guarded with zeal. Their scales, calibrated with official stone weights kept in temples, represented the very idea of commercial justice. A fraudulent scale could destroy reputations built over decades and fortunes accumulated over generations. Falsifying weights was a serious crime in practically all ancient civilizations. The Egyptians punished it with mutilation. The Babylonians applied very heavy fines. Biblical proverbs repeatedly condemned dishonest scales, calling them an abomination to the Lord. The book of Proverbs declares bluntly, "A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight." The prophet Amos denounces merchants who made the ephah small and the shekel great, falsifying the balances by deceit to trick poor buyers. This shows how much the entire economic system depended on technical and moral integrity. But weighing raw metal every time someone wanted to buy bread or a fish was completely impractical. Over time, throughout centuries, civilizations developed an ingenious solution. They began to create pieces of metal with a rigorously standardized weight and an official mark engraved. The first coins were born. The revolution was not only economic, it was profoundly social. Suddenly, any person could participate in commerce without needing scales or technical knowledge. It was enough to count. The first minted coins appeared around the 7th century before Christ in the region of Lydia, present-day Turkey. They were made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver found in the rivers of the region, especially in the famous Pactolus River. Quickly, the idea spread through the commercial routes of the Mediterranean. Persians created their imperial coins, the gold darics and the silver shekels, spreading them throughout their vast empire. Greeks refined the system with impressive diversity, each city-state minting its own coins with distinctive symbols. The owl of Athens became synonymous with monetary quality, and when the Roman Empire dominated the Mediterranean after conquering Greece and Egypt, the silver denarius became the most recognized and accepted coin of the ancient world, circulating from Britannia to Mesopotamia. Here enters a fundamental datum to understand the value of things in biblical times. A Roman denarius was equivalent to the payment for an entire day of work for a common laborer. This information appears directly in the Gospels, in the parable of the workers in the vineyard, in the 20th chapter of Matthew. The owner hires men to work and promises to pay 1 denarius per day. It was the standard wage of the time, neither generous nor exploitative, the minimum necessary for a small family to survive. Think about what this means in practical terms. If you earned 1 denarius per day of heavy labor, you needed to work 6 days a week to support your home. On the 7th day, the sacred Sabbath, no one worked by religious decree. Your monthly income revolved around 24 denarii in good months. With this tight amount, you paid for food for the family, clothes that wore out at work, Roman taxes that did not forgive delays, religious tributes to the temple, and eventual accumulated debts. Very little remained. Any unforeseen event represented an immediate crisis. Multiply this reality by thousands of families living in the villages of Galilee and Judea. The absolute majority of the population lived like this, on the margin between survival and disaster. Small farmers, fishermen, artisans, people who woke up before the sun and slept exhausted. People for whom each coin represented hours of brutal physical effort. When Jesus speaks about money in the parables, he speaks to this specific audience, people who viscerally understood the real weight of every cent. The monetary system of the time was incredibly complex. There was no single international currency. Each region, each empire, each period brought its own monetary units: Hebrew shekels, Roman denarii, Greek drachmas, talents for large sums, lepta for the poor. Converting values between these currencies required specialized knowledge. It was like traveling through 10 different countries, each with its own currency, without a conversion app. Money changes existed because of this complexity. They operated in the main markets and, crucially, in the courts of the Temple of Jerusalem, because the temple had a specific rule. Offerings and religious taxes could only be paid with silver coins of high purity, generally the Tyrian shekel. This Phoenician coin was famous for its consistency of weight and metal quality, maintaining rigorous standards even centuries after the Roman conquest. Roman coins with the image of the emperor and titles declaring him divine were considered idolatrous and inadequate for sacred use. They could not enter the temple treasury. In addition to the temple system, there was the heavy Roman tax burden. The empire collected taxes in various forms. The tributum capitis was a head tax, collected from each adult regardless of income. The tributum soli fell upon land properties. There were also taxes on transported goods, tolls on roads and bridges, and port fees. It is estimated that a common Jew of Galilee surrendered between 30 and 40% of his total production in combined taxes to Rome and the temple. The burden was crushing for families already living at the limit. Imagine the situation. A devout Jew travels for days to reach Jerusalem at Passover. He carries savings in Roman denarii, the currency that circulated in daily life. Upon arriving at the temple, he discovers he needs to exchange everything for Tyrian shekels to pay the tax and buy animals for sacrifice. The money changers charge fees for the conversion, frequently between 4 and 8%. The system benefited those who controlled the exchange tables, generally families connected with the priestly aristocracy. It was against this system that Jesus acted when he drove the vendors out of the temple. It was not just generic religious indignation, it was a specific economic denunciation. Mark records that Jesus cited 2 prophetic passages. "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of thieves." The tables of the money changers were physically overturned. The coins rolled across the stone floor. The gesture was public and dramatic. Jesus directly attacked the fusion between religion and financial exploitation. But how much money circulated at that time? And what was the difference between being poor, modest, and rich? The Gospels offer interesting and revealing clues. The poor widow, whom Jesus praises publicly, deposits 2 lepta into the temple treasury, the trumpet-shaped offering boxes positioned in the court of the women. The lepton was the smallest coin in circulation in the entire Jewish monetary system, a tiny piece of bronze so small it could barely be held between the fingers. 2 lepta together were equivalent to a single Roman quadrans, which in turn was worth only 1/64th of a denarius. In calculable practical terms, less than 2 minutes of the daily work of a common laborer. The price of a pinch of salt, perhaps less. But it was absolutely everything that widow possessed in the world, all her livelihood for that day. Jesus points out to the disciples that her miserable offering is worth infinitely more than the large, ostentatious donations of the rich, because they gave from what was comfortably left over, while she gave from her own poverty, sacrificing her survival. At the other extreme, we have figures like Zacchaeus, chief of the publicans of Jericho. The publicans were tax collectors for Rome, a class hated by practically all Jews. The system worked like this. Rome auctioned the right to collect tributes in a certain region. The winner of the auction paid a fixed amount to the empire in advance, and then kept absolutely everything he managed to collect above that official quota. The more he charged, the population, the greater his personal profit. The system practically incentivized extortion and abuse. Publicans were universally despised, considered traitors who collaborated with the Roman occupier. Ritually impure by constant contact with Gentiles, excluded from synagogues, avoided at weddings and in business. The later Talmud would even declare that it was permitted to lie to publicans, such was the aversion they inspired. Zacchaeus had enriched himself this way for years. When he converts after meeting Jesus, who scandalously invites himself to dinner at his impure house, he promises to give half of his goods to the poor and return 4 times what he stole from anyone. The fact that he could do this shows that his fortune was substantial. Between these extremes, the majority struggled not to fall into the most feared category, the debtor. Debts in biblical times did not function as they do today. There was no personal bankruptcy or facilitated renegotiation. If you owed and could not pay, the consequences were brutal. You could lose your lands, family inheritance transmitted for generations. You could be forced to sell children as temporary slaves. In extreme cases, you yourself became a slave to the creditor until the debt was cleared with labor. Jesus knew this reality. His parables are full of references to debts and creditors. The parable of the unmerciful servant speaks of a servant who owes 10,000 talents to the king. 1 talent was equivalent to 6,000 denarii. 10,000 talents would be 60 million denarii. For a common worker, more than 160,000 years of work. Impossible to pay in 1,000 lifetimes. The point of the parable was this: the forgiven debt was unpayable. And even so, the forgiven servant refuses to forgive another who owed only 100 denarii. 100 days of work, a real payable debt. The story exposes human pettiness in the face of divine grace. 100 denarii represented more than 3 months of wages. Now we reach the central episode, the 30 pieces of silver. Matthew records that the chief priests paid Judas Iscariot 30 pieces of silver to deliver Jesus. The Greek text uses the word argyria, which means pieces of silver. Scholars debate which specific coin was used. Some argue they were Tyrian shekels, the currency accepted in the temple. Others suggest Greek tetradrachms. Most agree that the total value was equivalent to approximately 120 denarii. 120 denarii. 4 months of work for a common laborer. Think about that. Judas sold his master, his friend, his spiritual leader for the equivalent of 4 months of wages. It was not a fortune capable of changing his life forever. It was not wealth that would guarantee comfort until old age. It was a significant amount, yes. It was enough to buy a small flock of sheep. It was enough to finance a long journey. It was enough to clear outstanding debts, but it was not the price of an important man, and that is exactly the point. The amount was not accidental. 30 pieces of silver had a specific meaning in Mosaic legislation. In the book of Exodus, chapter 21, the law establishes that if an ox gores a slave and kills him, the owner must pay the slave's master 30 shekels of silver. It was legal compensation for the value of a dead slave. Do you perceive the message? By paying 30 pieces of silver for Jesus, the religious authorities were pricing him as a slave, not as a prophet, not as a messianic king, not as a dangerous political threat. As a slave, the lowest value the law permitted to be attributed to a human life. It was a calculated insult, a declaration of contempt encoded in currency. The prophet Zechariah had anticipated this value centuries before. In the 11th chapter of his book, God asks the leaders of Israel to evaluate his work as a shepherd. They weigh 30 pieces of silver, and God responds with cutting sarcasm, "That magnificent price at which I was valued by them." The order is to throw the money to the potter. When Judas tries to return the coins, and the authorities use the money to buy the potter's field, the prophecy is fulfilled with disturbing precision. But let us return to the practical value. What could someone buy with 30 pieces of silver in the 1st century? An adult ox cost between 20 and 30 shekels depending on quality and region. A donkey, an essential animal for transport in mountainous terrain, went for around 15 shekels. Sheep varied between 3 and 5 shekels each. Goats cost a little less. With 30 pieces you could assemble a small flock of 6 to 10 animals, nothing negligible for a peasant, starting from zero, but far from consolidated wealth. Agricultural lands had variable prices. The field of Machpelah, bought by Abraham, cost 400 shekels. But it was a special plot with a cave for burials in a desirable location. Smaller fields, in less valued mountainous regions, cost much less. The potter's field bought with Judas's coins was probably land already degraded by clay extraction, of low commercial value. Clothes represented a significant investment. There was no industrial production. Each piece was hand-woven, dyed with laborious processes using natural dyes and sewn with care. A quality tunic could cost several denarii. Elaborate cloaks, especially those dyed purple, were worth small fortunes. With 30 pieces, you would equip an entire family with new clothes for years. Food was relatively cheap for those who had money. One denarius bought about 12 liters of wheat or 24 liters of barley. With 120 denarii, you guaranteed enough cereal to feed a family for an entire year. Wine, olive oil, and dried fish would complete the pantry. As for services, manual laborers received 1 denarius per day. Specialized artisans charged 2 or 3 denarii, depending on the complexity of the work. Carpenters, blacksmiths and masons were more highly valued. Doctors existed, but were a luxury for few. Most depended on home remedies and prayers. 30 pieces would pay for 1 month of work by a skilled artisan, or 4 months for a common laborer. It was enough to build a simple house of mud bricks. It was enough to equip a carpentry workshop. It was not enough to buy a palace, a fleet of ships, or a private army. Judas knew this. He managed the common purse of the disciples, according to John. He had a sense of values, prices, and daily budgets to feed 13 men traveling through Palestine. When Mary of Bethany anoints Jesus with pure nard perfume, a very rare aromatic oil imported from the Himalayan mountains through long and dangerous commercial routes, Judas complains that the perfume was worth 300 denarii and could have been sold to help the poor. The text of John reveals that his concern was not genuinely for the poor, but for the fact that he regularly stole from the common purse he managed. Even so, the economic data is relevant and probably accurate. 300 denarii for a single flask of luxury, aromatic perfume. Almost 3 times the price he accepted for Jesus. 10 months of work for a laborer. Pure nard was so valuable that the alabaster flask had to be broken to release the contents, ensuring that no one had adulterated or diluted the perfume. Mary broke the flask and poured everything over Jesus. A year's salary evaporating in minutes like an aroma in the air. The irony is absolutely devastating when contemplated. A simple perfume was worth more than what he asked for the Messiah himself. After the betrayal was consummated, the Gospels record that Judas was seized with remorse. The Greek text uses a specific word, metamelomai. It is not deep spiritual repentance. It is remorse, regret, emotional anguish. He realizes the weight of what he has done. He tries to return the money. He runs to the priests and throws the coins into the sanctuary. They respond coldly, "What is that to us? That is your problem." The damage is done. The religious authorities face an unexpected practical problem. They could not return the coins to the temple treasury, the sacred korban. It was blood money, currency contaminated by the death of a man, stained with guilt. The very law they supposedly defended forbade such money from entering the sacred coffers. The irony was sharp. They had conspired to kill an innocent man, but now they worried about the ritual purity of the treasury. So they deliberated among themselves and decided to buy the potter's field to serve as a cemetery for foreigners. Jews who died far from their land, pilgrims who passed away during the feasts, travelers without local family, would have a place for burial without contaminating regular Jewish cemeteries. The field received a sinister name that remained for generations, Akeldama. In Aramaic, field of blood. Ancient historians record that the location was still known by this name centuries later. 30 pieces, a sterile field, a cemetery for outsiders, the price of a life transformed into a dwelling for the dead. But money in biblical times was never just about economics. It was a complete moral language. It represented honor, debt, power, corruption. The prophets of the Old Testament constantly denounced unjust wealth. Amos thundered against those who sold the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Isaiah criticized those who joined house to house and field to field until there was no place for the poor. Micah accused the leaders of building Zion with blood and Jerusalem with iniquity. Money revealed character. He who accumulated at the expense of others showed his nature. He who shared demonstrated righteousness. When the poor widow deposits her 2 lepta, Jesus does not celebrate the quantity. He celebrates the proportion. She gave everything. The rich gave from what was left over. Divine arithmetic functions differently from human arithmetic. In the teachings of Jesus, money constantly appears as a moral test. No one can serve 2 masters. You cannot serve God and riches. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Each phrase attacks the illusion that accumulating goods brings security or true meaning. The rich young man who seeks Jesus, wanting to know how to inherit eternal life, receives an unexpected answer. Sell all that you have, give to the poor, and follow me. The young man goes away sad. He possessed many goods. The wealth that seemed a blessing became an obstacle. The money that promised freedom revealed itself as a chain. If money was so spiritually dangerous, why did God allow it to exist? The answer perhaps lies in the nature of the test. Money is neutral. It is neither good nor bad in itself. The problem lies in the heart that handles it. Abraham was rich and he was righteous. Job had immense possessions and he was upright. The question was never about possessing, but about being possessed. Wealth that serves becomes a tool. Wealth that dominates becomes an idol. The first Christians after Pentecost experienced a radical economy that completely challenged the prevailing standards. Acts of the Apostles describes a community where no one considered anything he possessed as exclusively his own. They sold inherited properties, houses, agricultural lands, and voluntarily deposited the full value at the feet of the apostles for distribution according to the specific need of each member. The text states with evident admiration, "There was no needy person among them." Barnabas, a Levite from Cyprus, sells a field and delivers all the money. Money flowed from hand to hand. It did not accumulate in private coffers. It served real needs, did not feed ambitions or build family empires. This model did not last forever. Ananias and Sapphira tried to manipulate the system, lying about the sale value. The judgment was severe, not for the withheld money, but for the lie to the Holy Spirit. Even in an idealistic community, financial temptation persisted. Returning to the 30 pieces, their legacy crossed centuries as a universal symbol of betrayal. In medieval art, Judas is frequently portrayed with a pouch of coins hanging from his neck. He became an icon of perverse gain, of the sale of the sacred, of the corruption that exchanges the priceless for the quantifiable. Any betrayal for money came to be compared to the 30 pieces. But perhaps there is another reading. Judas did not betray for immense wealth. He betrayed for a common amount, for the price of 4 months of work, for the value of a small flock, for the cost of a degraded field. And that makes his choice even more tragic. It was not the seduction of a fantastic treasure that brought him down. It was the ordinary temptation of immediate gain, of quick profit, of the apparently easy solution. How many times are eternal values sold for temporary advantages? How many times is the precious exchanged for the convenient? The 30 pieces do not need to be literal to repeat their pattern through the centuries. Every time someone abandons principles for profit, betrays relationships for interest, sacrifices integrity for comfort, the coins clink again in some dark room. In the end, biblical money reveals what it has always revealed since the first metal was weighed on a scale. Not the objective value of things, but the value that each heart attributes to things. Judas calculated that 30 pieces were worth more than the company of Jesus. He miscalculated for all eternity. The widow calculated that her 2 lepta were the maximum she could offer. She calculated correctly before God. The silver coins that bought the betrayal could not buy peace for Judas's conscience. They could not buy tranquil sleep or relief from guilt. They could not buy his own life, which he ended in despair. They could not buy anything beyond a sterile field to bury foreigners. Money promised much and delivered ashes. 2,000 years later, archaeologists still find ancient coins buried under the ruins of systematically excavated biblical cities. Roman denarii corroded by time and humidity, Tyrian shekels turned green by the oxidation of the copper in the alloy, bronze lepta so worn that the original images are barely recognizable. Coins lost in markets, forgotten in houses, destroyed by invaders, buried in haste by families fleeing wars who never returned to recover them. The metal that once bought warm bread, paid resentful taxes, sealed bitter betrayals, and financed dreams later abandoned now rests silent in climate-controlled museum display cases, carefully labeled and catalogued in digital databases. It has completely lost the original function that gave it meaning and power. It remains only as a mute testimony of a world that calculated value in a way apparently different from ours, or perhaps not so different, because the question remains alive, crossing centuries like a sharp blade. How much is that which has no price worth? How much would you ask to give up what you consider sacred? 30 pieces are still being counted at some table, in some place by someone who has not yet realized they are making the worst deal in history. Money in biblical times was never just about economics. It was about choices, about what reveals who we are when no one is looking, about the real weight of the things we carry in our hands and in our heart. The 30 pieces bought a slave, they bought a field, they bought 4 months of survival, but they could never buy what Judas needed most after spending them: forgiveness. And that is perhaps the final lesson that biblical money teaches to every generation willing to listen. Some things simply are not for sale. Some debts cannot be paid with metal. Some transactions, once closed, do not admit return. The coins continue clinking through the centuries. The question remains waiting for a personal answer from each one. What is your price? Is there a number that would buy your soul? May the answer, when it comes, not be 30 pieces of silver clinking in a leather pouch,